Okay. Okay. Man, I just started, felt like I just got a workout. Um, like I said, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who's here today. This is like a blessing. Um, I've never been to the city of Dubuque. I'm actually from Waterloo, Iowa, born and raised in Waterloo, but Dubuque has never really been on my radar. But I had a great opportunity working with Chris Olson in the city of Dubuque. I had a great opportunity to be one of the consultants when it came to researching and studying the African American history of the city. And through my studies, I was looking, I said, wow, I said, Dubuque is a little bit different because throughout the state of Iowa, it's kind of easy to identify like historical black communities or neighborhoods. A lot of times if you look at the history of the railroad, so if you look at the history of the Illinois Central Railroad or the Chicago Railroad, 90% of your African American communities are connected to the railroad, right? So no matter where you go in Iowa, if you want to learn about your black community, follow the railroad. The other thing about the city of Dubuque that was kind of unique for me, it's our state's first city. It's our state's first county. So if you're the first, to me, there should be some things in place that when people like myself visit, I'm connected. Because if your African American history is not visible and you're a historian or you're a person that's a fan of American history, what's happening is you're not telling the whole story now, right? And I think also through my research, just kind of like the different angles and things that I look at, when it comes to this black community, it never had a chance. You know, racism was so powerful in Dubuque County and in the city of Dubuque, it never gave this city a chance to have a black neighborhood or a black faith-based institution or a black small business community. And so I think if we take the next steps, so if you look at the world of historical preservation, I'm a fan of preservation, but I'm not like the biggest fan of preservation. But historical preservation gives facilities like this an opportunity to restore itself, to revitalize it, to build it. In some cases, you have faith-based institutions that create jobs through their institutions. So you have some places that have daycares and things of that nature. But also faith-based institutions are set up for tourism. So people probably from all over the world come to this facility. Matter of fact, when I came in here setting up today and yesterday, you had tourists coming in here to experience this faith-based institution. But if you want a African American experience in Dubuque, me being African American, I want a black experience in Dubuque, it's not here. It doesn't exist. It doesn't even have a platform. So preservation is one of those things, if you know how to use it, when it comes to significance, a lot of times you look at architecture. So sometimes when you look at preservation, you're looking at architecture and design of a building. But when it comes to Dubuque's black history, you didn't have black designers. You didn't have black architects. A lot of them probably lived in like shacks or blighted properties that somebody significant historically to this community was born in those facilities, but because it's a shack or because it's blighted, it doesn't qualify under the guidelines of the federal government, the National Park Service federal government. So one of the things I did was I created the Iowa African American Heritage Trail. I worked with this guy by the name of Doug Jones. He passed away. He actually was with the State Historical Society of Iowa. Had some time working with him, Steve King, Paula Moore, Lloyd Soik. It's a long list of people that's in the world of preservation. And we all agreed that when it came to ethnic people, in this situation, we're talking about African American people, we don't have a platform for preservation. So when it comes to the Certified Local Government Program, it doesn't work for African American properties or African American historic places. You could sell it like that, you could make it seem like it works, but I could tell the city of Dubuque, I could tell this audience right here, you don't have one African American property on the United States National Registers of Historic Places. So that just in itself tell you how far the residents and the black citizens of Dubuque are. So some of the challenges that I have is making sure first and foremost, that you guys understand what I'm talking about, right? Because if you don't understand what I'm talking about, we can't actually move forward. But once you get a grasp of what I'm talking about, and if I could plant a seed where you can see yourselves individually in what we're talking about, now we're going to do something great, right? So it's all about doing something great. So today, what basically, like I like to, on my end, I'm going to talk a little bit about Juneteenth and the history of the Emancipation Proclamation when it comes to the state of Iowa. Iowa has its own story when it comes to the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And I think a big piece of that story when you're talking about the emancipation is the Civil War. A big part of the Civil War was the city of Dubuque. I want to say Lincoln and the federal government or others allowed not just the city of Dubuque, but my hometown, Waterloo, Iowa, to have rail in 1865. So the year the Civil War started, Lincoln allowed Dubuque and my hometown to have railroad, right? So that gives us a common denominator just on that platform. But I think even bigger than that is when you look at the history of territories. If you look at the history of the Louisiana Territory, if you look at the history of the Michigan Territory, if you look at the history of the Iowa Territory, all these territories, they were under the rule of thumb of fugitive slave law. So when it came to the issue of slavery, it didn't matter if it was global, if it was the United States. The issue of slavery was always the conversation, no matter how you shaped it or formed it. So when it comes to this region, the Dubuque region, this region can help tell that whole story, right? When you look at the history of the Great Mississippi River, one of my passions, and you'll see that in my PowerPoint, and I'm talking so much right now, I'm so excited, my adrenaline is like real high right now. But when you look at the history of the Mississippi River, one of the things I wanted to do when I was a little bit younger, I always wanted to educate people about the Mississippi River. And the only reason why I did that was because my family was from Mississippi. So I felt like, okay, Mississippi River, my family from Durant, Mississippi, okay, there's a common denominator there. But when I actually started visiting these river towns, it was more than just the word Mississippi. You're talking about river towns, you're talking about Dubuque, you're talking about Clinton, you're talking about Muscatine, you're talking about Davenport, you're talking about Burlington, you're talking about Keokuk. All these river towns had their own piece when it comes to the Mississippi River. They had their own story. They have their own small businesses. I would go, like in Muscatine, Iowa, they got the Alexander Clark House, but they also had a location called Fruitland, which was an agricultural area that had Hispanics and black families that worked on this farm. If you go to Davenport, y'all see some stuff I'll show you later, but in Davenport, they had a thing called the Mississippi River Trail. The Mississippi River Trail is here too, but it was kind of unique in Davenport. The Mississippi River Trail had 10 to 15 lost and forgotten destinations that people can ride their bike on it, right? So I said, you know what? I'm gonna design a bike trail. And so I did. I'm gonna show you how the bike trail I designed. It's a pretty neat bike trail. But then in my hometown, Waterloo, Iowa and Cedar Falls, Iowa, it's a thing called the 24/7 Wall Street Report. And that report had a 98% white city, which is Cedar Falls, and the city of Waterloo had the third largest black population in our state as the worst place for African Americans in the United States of America. In the state of Iowa, Waterloo, Cedar Falls was the worst place for African Americans in the United States of America. And so one of the things I wanted to do was use my platform with the Iowa African American Heritage Trail and work with people that like my platform and see when it comes to being inclusive and when it comes to being diverse, that the Iowa African American Heritage Trail, some of the exhibit stuff you see in the back, that those resources can be put into educational institutions. If you get a chance, I just got approved with the University of Northern Iowa. We're doing a Black Life Youth Camp. You and I bought in with the idea of having young kids, inner city youth, helping with research and documentation of their local community's history. But also when it came to outdoor recreation, these same kids will learn about wildlife. They'll learn about conservation. They'll learn about the environment. They'll learn how Black people use the Mississippi River to bathe, to cook, to transport, just like everybody else. But then hopefully these same youth will be raving fans to help preserve African American history for future generations. Because right now, the situation we're in, if you were born in the 50s, 60s, some of you might have been born 50s, 60s, 70s, you're the next generation to die, especially when it comes to the history of civil rights. So if we don't create a platform here real soon, the last civil rights activists that could tell these stories, like the Scotts, the Suttons, people on that platform, they're not going to be here no more. And so then when you have this new Black community, I'm saying the younger generation of Black professionals, in the 80s you had a lot of Black professionals move to the city of Dubuque. They're not going to have a platform to know the whole story. They're just going to know their story. So enough of me talking. What I'm going to do is a great friend, somebody that knows her stuff, somebody when I needed somebody to lean on and get some things going, she was there at every call. I'm going to introduce RRS Stewart, and she's going to share with you guys a lot of the early history of this city, and I want to say some of the stuff is associated with the church. So, Mrs. Stewart.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you also to the volunteers from St. Luke's who helped with the lunch and greeting people and shepherding people around the church today. Vicki, can you advance to the next slide? All right, so this is the first church building in the state of Iowa. Dubuque is the oldest city in Iowa, having been established by a group of settlers in 1832 before they were pushed back across the Mississippi by the U.S. government to await its agreement with the Sac and Fox tribe, known as the Black Hawk Purchase, which took effect on June 1st, 1833. In the autumn of 1833, Dubuque was little more than a miner's camp and trading post. The first mention of a church is in the minutes of the Illinois Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church on September 25th, 1833, when circuit rider Barton Randall was assigned to the Dubuque mission. On November 6, 1833, Randall crossed the Mississippi and preached in the Bell Tavern, where the Hotel Julian now stands. The first church building, built in June and July 1834, was a log meeting house on the southeast corner of what is now Washington Park. 70 subscribers of both members and friendly sinners raised the necessary $225 for its cost, and friendly sinners is how they were described in the newspaper. The small cabin was used by other denominations and also served as a public school building and the first courthouse in Iowa. On March 25th, 1837, the building was the meeting place where citizens passed a resolution incorporating Dubuque as Iowa's first town. An article states that of the 70 donors to the first church building, among the contributors were several Negroes. The names of only 3 women appear on the list, and one of them was a former slave named Tilda. Historian Richard Lord Acton claims that Tilda was the sister of Ralph, the subject of Jordan J. Montgomery versus Ralph, a man of color, the first case decided by the Supreme Court of Iowa Territory on July 4th, 1839. Ralph was born a slave in Virginia around 1795 under the name Ralph Nelson. In infancy, he was given the name of his owner, Ralph Montgomery. Both later moved to Kentucky, where Ralph was sold to Montgomery's brother William, who in turn sold Ralph to his son, Jordan, in 1830. 2 years later, Jordan's family and slaves moved to Marion County, Missouri in 1834, Jordan made a written contract with Ralph for his freedom at the price of $550 with an additional $50 payment and interest imposed. Ralph traveled to Dubuque County with the hope of earning the money by mining lead, where he dug by Irishman Alexander Butterworth, who was also a partner in a grocery store. And Butterworth was also elected trustee of the town council. That same year, 1838, Jordan took out a $4,000 loan from the State Bank of Missouri. When the money was due to be repaid, Jordan sent agents called the Virginians to Dubuque to retrieve Ralph. The Iowa Territorial Assembly had passed an act to regulate blacks and mulattoes in January of 1839. Under Section 6, if a person or the agent applied to a justice of the peace and proved someone was their property, the justice of the peace could arrest the individual. Jordan's Virginians swore an affidavit that Ralph was Jordan's property, and they were his agents, and the justice of police directed the sheriff to deliver Ralph to them. The sheriff took the agents to Ralph's mineral lot, where the agents handcuffed him, put him in a wagon. However, his neighbor, Alexander Butterworth, went to Thomas Else Wilson, district court judge in Dubuque, and got a writ of habeas corpus, which is Latin for produce the body. They then rode to Bellevue, retrieved Ralph, and returned to Dubuque. Ralph appeared before Judge Wilson on June 1st, 1839, who transferred the case to the Supreme Court of Iowa Territory. The 3 district court judges composed the Supreme Court, but Wilson recused himself, and the court book records that Chief Justice Mason and Judge Williams heard the case in Burlington, the territorial capital at the time. The justices reasoned that the Articles of Compact in 1787 of the Northwest Ordinance, which stated neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territories, applied to Ralph. Furthermore, Ralph came to Iowa before there was a civil government in the area at all, and so he was not subject to the Black and Mulattoes Act of 1839. He was not a fugitive because he came to Iowa with Jordan's permission, and being in debt does not justify a return to slavery. The Missouri Compromise did not require emancipating runaway slaves. But if someone had given permission for a slave to live in free territory while earning money towards his freedom, that person cannot expect to them reclaim that person as property. Ralph's case was not referenced directly in the 1857 U.S. Supreme Court case Dred Scott, but in his dissent, Justice Curtis used a line of reasoning that was similar to that used by the Iowa Supreme Court in declaring Ralph free. Can you go to the next slide? This is the monument called Shattering Silence, which is outside the Iowa Supreme Court, and that's the monument to Ralph. The monument was designed by James Ellwanger. After the Iowa Supreme Court declared that Ralph was a free person, he worked in Judge Wilson's garden one day each spring in Sanks for the rest of his life until he died of smallpox on July 22nd, 1870. Judge Wilson actually lived at 1614 White Street. This is where the Dubuque Dream Center now stands, formerly the casino building for St. Mary's Church. Most of the structures connected to Ralph have been turned down. We don't know exactly where he lived. That log cabin church was the forerunner to this church. There's no longer a log cabin in Washington Park. And again, even the garden where Ralph worked in thanks to Judge Wilson is no longer there. But it is somewhat fitting that where that garden stood is where the Dubuque Dream Center now stands because of the work that the Dream Center does with youth in the community of Dubuque. If you can go to the next slide, this is the picture that was erected of the monument to Ralph that now stands in Linwood Cemetery. Ralph was not originally buried in Linwood. When he died, he was buried in what was known at what was the city cemetery at the time, which was Jackson Park. However, from 1869 to 70, that was turned into a park. All of the bodies were moved up to Linwood Cemetery into a plot called the Gone But Not Forgotten plot. And in 2016, Linwood Cemetery, along with Dubuque NAACP, erected this monument on that plot, which is where all the graves from the former cemetery in Jackson Park were moved to. And it is the only marker at Linwood Cemetery that's not actually above an individual person's grave, because it's on the plot where all of the former graves from Jackson Park were moved to. Next slide, please. So this is the monument to the former Methodist Church in Washington Park, which is also connected to the next person we're going to talk about as well. And if you read the description on that monument, in addition to the 70 people who donated to the building of this log cabin, there are actually 12 charter members. And on this monument, it just says one of the charter members was a black woman. But that black woman had a name, and she's described as Charlotte Morgan, a colored sister. And Charlotte Morgan is the wife of Nathaniel Morgan, who is the next person we're going to talk about. So if you can go to the next slide. This is 1839. This is the Centenary Church. This is the next Methodist church that was built on the northwest corner of 17th and Locust Streets. This is the same year that the Supreme Court of Iowa ruled that Ralph was not a fugitive slave. Again, Dubuque's early economy was dominated by lead mining and related activities. In 1840, 72 African Americans lived in Dubuque, giving the city Iowa's largest black population at the time. Also on that census, 16 slaves belonging to 11 families in Dubuque were recorded, and instances of slavery were reported in the state as late as 1852. If you can go to the next slide, this is the 1840 census, where Nathaniel Morgan is listed. You can see on the far right is the column for free colored persons. In the household, there are 2 free colored males listed between the ages of 24 and 36, and 1 free colored female, that would be Charlotte, between the ages of 36 and 54. However, we think probably both Charlotte and Nathaniel were about the age of 40 at this time. On September 6, 1840, a mob of white residents murdered Nathaniel Morgan. He was accused of stealing clothing, dragged from his place of employment, tied to a post, and whipped until his back was nearly fleshless. He was then taken to various places to look for the items he was accused of stealing, finally ending up on the bluffs where he was beaten to death by the mob. Morgan was returned to his home on 2 poles. Nathaniel Morgan did not have the privilege or advantage of a trial before his death. 3 leaders of the mob, James Compton, Colonel Kane, and a 3rd unidentified man, were tried for the murder, but acquitted on the grounds that their intention to commit murder had not been proven. By 1850, while Dubuque's Caucasian population had increased 10 times, the population of African Americans in Dubuque had fallen to 29, in part due to Nathaniel Morgan's lynching in 1840. If you can go to the next slide, this is the 1850 census. Charlotte Morgan is listed on here near the bottom. She's listed as a housekeeper to 2 minors, Isaac Simpson and Richard Harvey. This is in District 7, which ran along Bluff Street in between 7th and 10th, and up the bluff, i.e. Hill Street to Pine, now Caledonia. So basically after Nathaniel's death, she stayed in the city of Dubuque, and we know that Ralph was one of the people who stayed in the city of Dubuque as well, because he died here in 1870, although many other of the black population left as well. And Ralph Montgomery, Nathaniel Morgan, and Charlotte Morgan all would have been married in Jackson Park. And this is one reason why Dubuque NAACP has floated the idea of renaming Jackson Park Montgomery Morgan Park, because it is one of the few tangible places remaining that's connected to Nathaniel Morgan and Ralph Montgomery, because we know that is where they would have been buried, because that's where everyone was buried before all of the bodies were moved out to Linwood Cemetery. All right, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so this is the 1853 Main Street Church, and that is roughly next door to where we are now. If you can go to the next slide. However, the Centenary Church still plays a part in this story, because after the main church population moved to the Main Street Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church opened up in the Centenary Church. So the African Methodist Episcopal Church is listed as being in the Centenary Church. So that building that's circled is the Centenary Church that was built in 1839. So when the main Methodist Church moved into the new Main Street Church location, the African Methodist Episcopal Church opened up in the Centenary Church location. We don't have a listing of the African Methodist Episcopal Church before 1868. That top listing is from 1868. So, and there's actually a lot of records missing in our archives here at St. Luke's between 1853 and 1868. So I don't actually know what was happening to the Centenary building during that time, if actually St. Luke's still owned it and they were just using it as an auxiliary space after they moved over onto this location, and that was just like a meeting house, an extra space they had, or if they had sold the structure and it just kept being referred to as the Centenary space. However, we know it was still referred to as the Centenary Church, because after the African Methodist Episcopal Church was organized, in a newspaper article, the pastor for that church was inviting potential members to attend the Centenary Church where they were having their services. And we also know, if you go to the next slide, that Centenary Church building was serving as the colored school. So on the left is the information about the colored school from 1867. And this is one of the articles about the colored school that was found during the Black Heritage Survey Project. On the right is an article from 1877, which is when the Dubuque schools were ordered integrated. And so I'm going to read that article to you about the integration of the Dubuque schools. So this ties back to another person that Charles mentioned earlier. So actually in 1867, Susan B. Clark tried to attend grammar school number 2 down in the Muscatine School District. And this is a case that went all the way to the Iowa Supreme Court, and they ruled that because African Americans were paying taxes in Iowa, they were entitled to attend public schools in Iowa, and that the public schools should be integrated. So Susan Clark's name appeared on the list of high school graduates in 1871. The first graduation of students of any race from a high school in Dubuque took place in 1870. And that's mostly because there was only one high school in Dubuque. So regardless of your race, the high school was integrated. However, as you can see from this, the Dubuque community continued to segregate the elementary schools until the 1877 school year. And I actually have a transcription of that article up there for you that I will read to you now. All right. I think I have too many papers up here. I can't find the exact subscription. But basically, Judge Wilson, who made his first appearance back in 1839 in the Ralph case, said to the school district, integrate your schools. And they offered no defense because they knew the Supreme Court had already ruled 10 years earlier. And so the Dubuque schools were integrated in 1877, all the way down to the elementary school level. All right, next slide. So this is from 1884, which shows what was the Centenary Church. Because it no longer needed to be used as a school, it was no longer, it's now being shown as a park livery building by 1880. And we also know that the African Methodist Church had moved out as of that building too. It's no longer referred to as a Centenary Church. By 1880, there's an article in the Dubuque Telegraph-Herald that says the African Methodist Episcopal Congregation has purchased a lot at the rear of the Lorimer House on Julian Avenue, at which they have erected a church building at a cost of about $1,000. And so the indication appears to be, even if the larger Methodist Church had held on to the Centenary building after it moved to Main Street, it had sold it by 1880, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church had purchased their own building once they no longer needed the building to be used as both a church and a school. If you can go to the next slide. So this shows Julian Avenue, which is now University Avenue. And in that area to the side of University Avenue, what's now a parking lot, there's a street called Robinson. So at the top, you see where Julian and 8th Street combine. At the bottom, that's the lower part of Julian Avenue. And in the top left is just a blow-up of where the African Methodist Church was located on that Robinson Street area. And again, it was there by 1880. So by 1880, it had moved out of the Centenary Church location and into its own specifically purchased and built location. All right, next slide. So again, the Main Street Church building was erected in 1853, and that's the predecessor to the building that we're in now. All right, if you can go to the next one. So this is the final St. Luke's building that we're in now, but this also brings to the last person I'm going to talk about today, which is the Martin family. So if you can go to the next slide, please. And this is just, again, the floor plan, and go to the next slide. So this is the census page from 1900, which is when we have the first appearance of Henry Martin. So after the Civil War, Dubuque's African-American population grew again to 76 people, enough, as we've talked about, to organize the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Prior to that time, most African Americans in Dubuque had been members of the congregation that later became known as St. Luke's. The newspaper attributed the population growth to free blacks coming north, as the headline from a Dubuque Herald article from April 23, 1861 put it. Some came to work on the steamboats, and that's how Henry Martin, Robert Martin's father, got to Dubuque. On the 1900 census, which is the one we have on the screen, Henry is 25. His parents, Ambrose and Hattie, were living in Natchitoches, Louisiana. He is listed as a cook on a steamboat. The family was originally from Miney, Louisiana, where they were mail carriers. If you can go to the next slide, this is the 1910 census. He's listed as living in Dubuque, married to Maddie. He's working as a porter in a hotel. His oldest son, Henry Jr., is 1, and the family called him Hank. If you go to the next slide, that's from the 1920 census. And in between 1910 and the 1920 census, Henry Sr. went back to Louisiana to train and then come back to Dubuque. And this is reflected on the census because Henry Jr. and Clarence are listed as born in Iowa, but Lillian and Vivian were born in Louisiana. Henry Sr. is listed as widowed and a doctor. By this time, he was a chiropodist, what we would say as a podiatrist today. And at some point, he became a member and trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is also this time period between 1910 and 1920, are during the years of World War I. During that time, the Fort Des Moines Provisional Army Officer Training School was where African Americans were trained to be officers for the U.S. Army. The grounds of Fort Des Moines were used for U.S. Army training began in 1901, the year Henry began living in Dubuque, and the African American 25th Infantry Regiment began training there in 1903. Although 3 African Americans had previously graduated from West Point, the First World War presented the initial opportunity for African American soldiers as a group to become commissioned officers in the United States Army. Of the 1,000 college graduates and faculty who started, 639 graduated or captains or lieutenants from Fort Des Moines in October 1917. To return to the Martin family, Hank, the oldest son, graduated from Dubuque Senior High School in 1926, and Robert graduated in 1936. If we go to the next slide, on the 1930 census, Henry is listed as married again with several more children born in Iowa: Hetty, Robert, Thornton, Dolores, and Joseph. And then if we go to the this is the second page of that slide because the Martin family was at the bottom of the previous page and now they're at the top of this one. And then if we go to the next page, this should be the 1940 census, where he's listed as widow again, and his sister Rosetta Brown is listed as living with them. In 1940, the US population was about 131 million, 12.6 million of which were African American, or about 10% of the total population. During World War II, the Army became the nation's largest minority employer. Of the 2.5 million African American males who registered for the draft, more than 1 million were inducted into the armed forces. During World War II, President Roosevelt responded to complaints against discrimination by issuing an executive order directing that blacks be accepted into job training programs, and he established the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Hank, the oldest son, enlisted in the Navy. Robert Martin was one of 12 Iowans to attend the first training facility for black combat pilots at Moulton Field in Tuskegee, Alabama during World War II. Moulton Field at Tuskegee was built by prominent African-American engineer Archie Alexander, who was a native of Ottumwa, Iowa. If you go to the next slide, this is actually a picture of Robert Martin in his pilot's uniform. If you, next slide, this is the 1944 St. Luke's Directory. And if you go to the next page, you see the Martin family, Mrs. Henry Martin, and then the children Thornton Martin, and the top page Dolores Martin and Joseph Martin. These are Henry Martin's children with his second wife. And because of this directory, we know that the African Methodist Episcopal Church closed by 1944. Because Henry Martin was a trustee of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, we don't think that his children and his widow would have been listed as members of St. Luke's Church if the African Methodist Episcopal Church was still in existence as of 1944. We also know that they had been having some financial difficulties prior to this time. So we do know that earlier they were looking for some ways to try to sustain themselves. In 1924, there were about 200 blacks living in Dubuque, and about 100 of them belonged to St. Peter's African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the name that it had at the time. However, by 1929, it had fallen on financial difficulties and was actually talking to St. John's Episcopal Church, wondering if they could get some financial assistance from the Episcopal Church if they became affiliated with it. And then again, we know that by 1944, the African Methodist Episcopal Church had closed and had been, and what members that still remained had either become members of St. Luke's United Methodist Church or St. John's Episcopal Church. World War II ended in Europe on May 8, 1945. On July 26, 1948, President Truman issued an executive order abolishing segregation in the armed forces and ordered full integration of all the services. Dr. Henry Martin died in 1951. All right, if you can go to the next slide. These are some more images of, again, that Hill Street area where that, the top left, again, shows where that African Methodist Episcopal Church was. This is that same Sanborn map, but we're starting to get into the overlays from 1950, about the time that it was starting to close. If you go to this next map, this continues up University Avenue, also called Julian Avenue, Hill Street at the time. So Hill Street's branching off. You see Hill Street at the bottom, and at the very top, at the map on the right, the house right above the N in North Hill Street, that's where the Martin family lived. And that house still exists. So this is one of the few houses connected with a historic family that's still around. All right, if you go to the next slide, this is just a reminder that the ribbon cutting ceremony for the naming of Dubuque Airport after Robert Martin is coming up on July 19th. If you can go to the next slide, this is a mock-up of the plaque that's going to be put up in the airport, dedicating the terminal facility to him. So again, he lived from 1919 to 2008. That shows 3 of the awards that he got: a Purple Heart, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and an Air Medal with 6 oak clusters. And just to summarize his biography briefly, he was born and educated at Dubuque, graduated Dubuque Senior High School in 1936. He received his degree in electrical engineering from Iowa State in 1942. He also earned his pilot's license. After he entered the Tuskegee Flight Training Program, he received his wings on January 7, 1945. Robert was shot down on March 3, 1945. He evaded capture for 6 weeks before rescue and return to Italy. And then this last slide is a picture of Ruby Sutton, because Lynn Sutton's going to be talking after me. As I mentioned, Robert Martin's father, Henry, died in 1951. By the time that Henry Martin died in the 1950s, the African American population in Dubuque had fallen to the point where, when Ruby Sutton moved to Dubuque in 1859 with her family, she said she was one of only 5 African American families in Dubuque at that time. So in the roughly 100 years of African American history I've covered, we've had a lot of ups and downs in terms of the population. So again, we went from, in the 1830s, Dubuque having the largest African American population in the state, to dropping very, very low in the 1840s, again, probably as a direct result of the lynching of Nathaniel Morgan. It then increased a lot following the Civil War as part of the Great Migration, when you had African Americans moving to all of the northern cities, and then it decreased again during the Great Depression. So with that, I'm going to conclude my history of the early years of African American history in Dubuque. In addition to the models I showed you on the screen, I also had models on the little table up here of the 4 Methodist churches that I was talking about. So afterwards, if you're walking around, if you want to look at the Methodist church models or look at the display that Charles has set up at the back of Dubuque history, you can. One of the slides does mention the Clark family. Again, I mentioned Susan Clark. She was from Muscatine, but it was her Supreme Court that ordered all Iowa schools, including Dubuque's, be integrated. And there is a little display about her father, Alexander Clark, in the back. All right, thank you.
Wow, that was really good. I learned a lot just from that piece right there. And I think what's key is we all learn something from that, and it's really your story, right? It's the history of Dubuque, Iowa. And to me, some of the things that we want to consider, like one of the things I've done, in Waterloo, they had this thing called IJAG. It's like a program for like underserved kids, like in the high school and in the middle schools. And so what we did with IJAG was spend 2 years in there working with those students to help us do the research of their neighborhood and their community. And from there, what we ended up doing with that research, we used it to create a walking tour. So I started thinking of, I'm sitting here like, okay, we did a self-guided walking tour with the same type of information in my hometown, and I think we could implement a plan for your city to do the same exact thing. Because I think what Ms. Sutton has been able to do, Ms. Stewart has been able to do, she's already showed us the blueprint. We just saw it. She's identified sites. So that means when we walk out this door, we're already connected to locations that's significant to the African American history of the city of Dubuque. The thing is what do we plan on doing with it? Are we going to walk out this door and say, hey, that was a great presentation? Or are we going to walk out this door and take the next steps to make sure that this lost history or forgotten history, something is done with it? Okay, coming up next, I want to say Mrs. Scott, the Scott family. This family is kind of unique because this is kind of like right up my alley a little bit. Miss Sandy Scott, we've been talking back and forth, and I think the beautiful thing about her story is the Catholic teaching. So when it comes to the Catholic Church and the Catholic community, her family is Catholic, and her and her sister was actually the first African American students at Wahlert, at Dubuque Wahlert, a Catholic school. And so it's going to be very interesting to hear their story and learn more about the Catholic Church and the African American community. Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm usually pretty loud. I used to be a lector down at St. Raphael, so if I get too loud, raise your hand or something. My name is Sandra Lee Scott. I was born in Dubuque, December 29th, 1945. My parents came to Dubuque in around 1941, 42. Sylvia and I are what you call Irish twins. Sylvia was born in February of 1945, and I was born in December because I was a preemie. I was in such a hurry to get here. My life in Dubuque, people have always asked me, why do you live in Dubuque? Why do you stay in Dubuque? There's nothing for you to do. But my life in Dubuque, Sylvia and I were together, and then finally, maybe I should tell a little bit about the family first. My grandparents were here, Inez Sibley and Henry Sibley, and my mother and father, Patricia Scott and Samuel Scott. My grandfather and my dad worked for the Illinois Central Railroad for over 40-some years. And then we have Sylvia, the first. I was second, Sandra Lee. Then there was my brother, Patrick. And then was my sister, Michelle. Michelle, I think, is going to be coming in later this afternoon. But we were a small family, very close. We were the type of family that you sat at the kitchen table and you ate your meal and you talked. And any discussions that you had or problems that you had, they were discussed at the table. It wasn't the TV tray in front of the TV. We didn't have a lot of the technologies and things that kids have today. When my mom said, go outside and play, you didn't grab a bunch of toys and go outside and play. You used your imagination and you went outside and played. We played school, we played all kinds of things, jump rope, whatever there happened to be, we played it. But we would spend a lot of time outside and communicating. That's one of the main keys, is communicating with each other. We were baptized at the Cathedral of St. Raphael. My mother was Catholic, my father was not. My grandparents were not Catholic, but my mom was, so Sylvia and all of the girls and Patrick were baptized and went to school at the Cathedral of St. Raphael. From there, we went to Wahlert High School. Wahlert had just finished building their high school in 1959, so our class was the first class to go through Wahlert High School. We graduated in 1963. After that, I went to Bayless Business College for 2 years. Some of you may not even know what Bayless Business College was because it doesn't exist anymore, but I went there for 2 years and I studied accounting. There I went to take a civil service test, and fortunately enough, I was able to get in through the United States Department of Agriculture, Farmers Home Administration, and that's where I worked for 48 years. Started at the Federal Building in downtown Dubuque, which is now called the Historical Federal Building. We just call it the post office. And then they moved it out to our offices, all agriculture offices, rather, out to Epworth in about 1980, I think it was. As a matter of fact, it was April 1st, 1980. It's the day we moved. And believe me, that was an April Fool's Day. I've always enjoyed living and working in Dubuque. I served on the Girl Scouts all of my life, it seemed, because that was one of the things that we did in our activities and stuff for kids to do. So Girl Scouting was one. We used to go to the did whatever everybody else was doing in the city at that time. Our community was, black community was small. I know people had a hard time determining, should we refer to you as black or Negroes or African American wasn't used as a terminology that much back in the 50s and 60s. I didn't know anything about Juneteenth or did not learn that stuff. As a matter of fact, we didn't have black history in our classrooms when we were in grade school or really high school. There were some books in the library you could go read, but we did not study it per se like we do today. We didn't recognize Martin Luther King. That was, they were doing the marches, not able to go integrate into white schools. And those were type of discussions that I would like to have gotten involved in now that I can see forward. I would like to have gotten involved in, but we never discussed history classes or any type of classes like that in school because I think they talked about other things, but not so much about black history and what was going on. Talked about them at the kitchen table, but you probably did not. We did not anyway have them discussed in school. After I retired, or I think a little while I was working too, I was on the working for the United States Department of Agriculture was also rewarding for me. That was very rewarding for me. I loved my job, I really did. And working in the rural area. Something a lot of people don't know, I was in the theater. I did a lot of theater work, and I enjoyed that. They say the first thing to go is your mind. They're right. Sometimes I'll be sitting thinking of something and all of a sudden. It's been hard. There has been a lot of negative attitudes of people. A lot of little apartments all over on 8th Street in that little section there. Picture, I can count 4 or 5 pictures that we took while we were growing up, because mom and dad never took that many pictures, but I know you do today. We added today where there's all of A Street looking down the viaduct, looking down A Street. That goes back to the 20s because you can look at the cars and see that those are 1920 cars. Live and you learn and you enjoy life no matter where you are or who you are. You just take it for what it's worth.
But that's another important piece, just like what she was saying. Just because they have an make sure that their stories is always told. O- Okay, okay. You got like a, Let's give her, oh, we got one more question right here.
No, there were other families living there too. That's about the only place the black people were living. Yes, there was a Rock Street, but Rock Street, we didn't live on Rock Street. That was like when you go up 9th and you go into University. Rock Street used to be there. Yes, and that's in one of those old pictures that I showed. That Rock Street. Blacks to come out of Waller High School also. But we were the first two, and then it was Patrick, and then it was Michelle. I have a shuttle I have to catch, so thank you, folks.
Okay, give her, yeah. Wow. That was really good. That was, what part? Jackson, Mississippi, Vicksburg, Mississippi is their hometown, and my family came from Durant and Jackson. And Natchez, Mississippi. So that Mississippi River thing kind of spread a little bit, because me myself, like I said, I'm a big fan of the Mississippi River, but when you say the word Mississippi, it goes a long way. Okay, we're gonna keep this thing going, and that was great. The next person coming up is Mrs. Sutton. She's also been a big asset. Me and her had long conversations, and she taught me so much about the city of Dubuque, African American community, especially when it comes to her mom and her being an activist. So coming up next is Miss Lynn Sutton.
Good afternoon, everyone. This picture you see here is a picture of Ruby Sutton, my mother. This is a picture of her firstborn child, David Sutton. Now, one thing I would tell you that is not from a hospital here in Dubuque, because we weren't allowed to be birthed. My father had to drive my mother over to Hazel Green, Wisconsin to be born. So that is one of the first pictures. Brings back some memories. So therefore, next slide, please. This is a picture later, Mom and Dad in front of their house. Their house was built in 1885. And I'm gonna read you a part of what the abstract said, because they had to really go through some challenges to get the house, because the house would not originally be sold to them. They tried several times, and a man that my father got to know, a contractor, bought the house and sold it to my parents. Now here's what the abstract read. The abstracts thus far in Dubuque, there's 150 homes that have this listing. No part of said property, nor any portion thereof shall be for sale the term of 50 years occupied by any person not of the Caucasian race. It being in land in thereby to resist the use of said property, and for 50 years not to be sold to anyone of Negro or Mongolian descent. So therefore, if we really talk about diversity and inclusivity, that writing has to go away, because right now, the house that I live in, their house, has that language. Pretty devastating. I mean, when we went through looking at all the paperwork, that's the language that is in there. Next slide, please. And we talk about our family, there we all are. You'll see my parents, whom are no longer alive, and my brother in the striped shirt, who is no longer alive, and my sister, who is not present because she had already passed away, and a brother that had passed away. But this was at Mom and Dad's 53rd wedding anniversary celebration. Next slide, please. This was some of the community work that Ruby Sutton had did. She had taken a bunch of youth to see the Harlem Globetrotters down at Five Flags Center. She did a lot of activities that way. She would raise the money and get the funds to take kids who may not have went otherwise to these events. So she was always out there and active doing things and helping the community move forward. Next slide, please. This is a picture of my grandmother, Catherine Henderson, my mother's mother. She came per the railroad that was here at the time, Illinois Central Railroad that Charles talked about. My father and several of his co-workers, that was the main occupation, and they transferred in from Mississippi to be on the railroad. And that was the main occupation, was the railroad at that time. And it was one of the few jobs that paid well and hired people of color. Next slide. This is one of the awards my mother received, the state honoring her. She worked for Operation New View for 50 years, a community action agency that she and Jan Gleitner and Sister Janan Hickey started. And so therefore she is being honored. The woman she's hugging is my niece. I call her Suzette, so that's her name. Her official name is Maria Sutton. My father is in the background. Next slide, please. This was a march, Martin Luther King Day. My mother was president of NAACP for 10 plus years, if not 20 plus years. But on that day, there she was in front leading the march down. At that time, we could still walk in the middle of the street for the march. Now we're just reduced to the sidewalk. And she would lead the march and did that for several years. Next slide, please. My mother was, you'll see some other faces I'm going to talk about in here. My mother singing in the church choir. And the ones of you that knew her talked about her faith in God and how strong it was. And she always gave people the word of God. Even when we were children, and we would go to school, because we were the only kids of color at that time. And she would tell us, now remember, I want you to remember something. I love you and God loves you. And don't let them turn you around. And we'd be like, yeah, right, Mom, whatever. But she conditioned us at that point, that young, before she sent us out the door. And people will ask me, how can you do that in Dubuque? I said, you have to remember, I was conditioned at knee-high for this. It didn't just happen. It doesn't just happen. The woman to the second to the left, Claudette Carter Thomas, was the first African-American probation officer here. Her husband, Jerome, was one of the first Black apprentices here. Jerome is no longer living with us. So I want to bring that part in. Next slide, please. Operation New View. This is part of the original crew members. And Art, you're off the hook. I don't have you in this picture. But this is Jan Gleitner's with the chair. She is there. Mary, and I can't think of who all those are. I have to look at all the names. Next slide, please. This is the article about the award from the First Citizen Award and being honored through the state for all Ruby's accomplishments. When I was going through this huge Rubbermaid container, I had almost forgotten how many things she had. It's like, I had to just narrow it down. It's like, we'll be here all day if I talk about this. Next slide, please. Not sure who this man is, but we talked about military people, and there's several pictures of military people that lived here in the area that my mother became friends with or known of. But he does have a name badge on, so it will be someone we can trace to see who he is, and give some background in our next go around with that. Another picture from church. Church was very important. You had to go to church. There was no ifs, ands, buts, or maybes. You were in church.
What church?
Rock of Ages Missionary Baptist Church. That is still here today. Next slide, please. Some more military families. Unknown who they are, but that is something we're going to research. Next slide, please. Now this picture is when I was sworn in Dubuque City Council, March 4th, 2011. First African-American woman to be elected to the city council, and prior to that, I was appointed. My mother's there on the right, Kathy's there on the left, John Taylor, and Ricardo Cunningham. And I didn't think my mother was going to be able to make it to that because she'd been very ill, she'd been hospitalized, and I looked up and there she was. I thought, what the heck? And I mean, she had been in intensive care that week prior to this, and I thought, Mom, don't worry about it. She don't have to be there. You can watch it on TV. Like I said, I turned around and there she was. I thought, wow, how'd she do that? Very pivotal moment, very pivotal moment. Next slide. That's the last one. Okay, I'm gonna read something in her words here. I guess one specifically thing that I'm proud of, I've always been a strong-willed and even stronger believing something is right. I've tried to find a way to express it and get to the point where when I come to help people in Dubuque. That is what has led me to do what I do, because I know out there's a better way, and I can open people's minds and through people's hearts. And with God's help, I know I can help change some things. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you all for listening. Does anyone have any questions? Charles. Yes, she was. Because she broke down a lot of barriers, a lot of doors. Because you talk about this pamphlet further in, she talks about how when she went to Operation Review and she would go to people's doors and they would slam the door in her face, she would still leave a note and say, well, we have programs that can help you. Call me when you're ready. And she said, as time went on, that happened, but it didn't happen right away. A lot of doors got closed, people told her to leave, whatever have you, but she didn't give up. She kept going back, and eventually that happened, but that was over a period of time, because even Dad working on the railroad, a lot of harassment. People would put rocks and sand in his lunch and his food and everything, and he couldn't eat it. And so Mom had went to a meeting that the railroad was having, their corporate meeting, and she went in and said, if you want this railroad to work, you're gonna have to stop that harassment, because otherwise it's not going to work. Well, they're like, well, we do want it to work, and so therefore they took measures to have that harassment stop, because they wanted it to be a success. So yeah, she even at City Hall, when Andre LeSears was hired, that was due to her really banging on the city manager's door. We need to talk about this. It's time to have an African-American person here working in the city. So those behind the scenes thing, people didn't know what happened, but a lot of them she was instrumental in. Anyone else? Yes, Kathy. It was my parents that first came. My grandmother lived in Illinois, but always came to visit us regularly. 1959. Pardon me? Yes. Going once? Twice? Gone. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, that to me, just thinking about that, just the few pictures I looked at, when you look at the civil rights movement, a lot of times people look at the civil rights movement from a national platform, but they never look at it from a local platform, right? And so for me, and this is just me, it's so hard. I remember when I first came to Dubuque and I saw Ruby Sutton. I thought she was an athlete. I thought she ran in the Olympics, was a state champion in track or something like that. And so what I was trying to do is I was trying to put two and two together. I was like, okay, is Miss Sutton, because they're honoring her, when it comes to the Multicultural Center and when it comes to the Recreation Center. But I think if you really want to get it right, you have to look at her civil rights activity. That's who she really was. She wasn't an athlete. She probably was diverse. I saw different people that was diverse, but when it came to activism and being a civil rights activist, that's to me who she really was. And I think future generations, you want them to know her like that too, and not accidentally think that she shot jumpers and stuff like that. Okay, but that was good. I learned some more again. We want to speed it up because I know we starting to press time. Okay, so this is my slide, I think. So Pearson Consulting, we'll talk a little bit about what I do. So when it comes to consultation, I work with the State Historical Society for probably about somewhere between 5 and 10 years. So when it came to the State Historic Preservation Office, some of the things that I was learning by accident was that architecture and design of a building was not helping us tell our African American history or our African American story. So if you wanted to use a certified local government program and you wanted to preserve a black neighborhood, or if you wanted to preserve a African American property, there wasn't really a platform for that. So and then the other thing I started noticing was the majority, when I would travel around the state, the majority of African American historic places or landmarks that you could visit, the majority of them were blighted, or the majority of them were in restricted areas, or places that had housing restrictions, covenants, that type of thing like that. So if you look at 90% of our state's African American community, so if you just even look at the whole state's African American population and community, you don't have not one black neighborhood or one black community on the National Register of Historic Places. So that means all the black neighborhoods, if you look at the Green Book, I don't know if any of y'all ever looked at the Green Books. The Green Book was something that was created by the Department of Transportation. So when it came to having a safe route to go somewhere throughout the United States, these Green Books would connect you to different black communities around the United States. Not one of those communities in Iowa has ever been preserved. So anything significant to a neighborhood, a park, anything that black people cherished or participated in, faith-based institutions, it doesn't exist. So I started my company. I said, I think when it comes to being a historical resource consultant, and when it comes to African American historical resources, I felt like that at that time I was the only expert in that field, not being arrogant or anything like that, but when it came to passionately trying to figure out how do you say black history, not just in Iowa, but how do you preserve black America, I made it an oath to myself that I wanted, if there wasn't other experts, that one day I wanted to be that expert. So that's kind of like my company. Next slide, please. So I kind of tried to shape this thing for the city of Dubuque So what we're trying to do is say, okay, if people come and visit and tour this city, what are they going to experience and what are they going to spend their money on? Because the whole thing is, history is not just built around just reading a publication and those types of things. History is one of those things that if you can connect people to Black history, now there's a good chance they're going to spend money in your Black community, right? So if we can connect people to Black America. So right now I'm working on, it's called the United States African American Heritage Trail. Currently, you guys are looking at the Iowa African American Heritage Trail. But the big picture for me is to be able to take lost and forgotten places, lost and forgotten communities, and take a trail system and connect everybody to those trails. It doesn't matter if we walk it, bike it, ride it, hike it, canoe it. What my job is to get you connected to Black America. And so one of the things that I'm doing currently is I partner with the Mississippi River Trail. I had a great opportunity to work with the Department of Transportation, the Mississippi River Trail Group, the Great River Road. I saw the Great River Road here. And all these guys are infatuated with the fact that we're taking the Great Mississippi River and we're connecting people to Black history in river towns up and down the Mississippi River. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what we're trying to do is what I'm trying to do today is paint you guys a picture and say, okay, if this is where Iowa started, right? And if we like to explore Dubuque, and if Dubuque has been here since 1833, what does Black life along the Mississippi River looks like? When it comes to explore Dubuque Black history, what does that look like, right? We don't even know, because after we walk out this building, we're just gonna walk out to what's out there. So right now it's kind of exciting because we're having that conversation about what direction we could go this way. But when it's all said and done, when all of us walk out this building, this still doesn't exist. So this is work in the makings. So that logo over there, the Iowa African American Heritage Trail, it's going to be a great opportunity for this city to be part of this trail. Right? So a lot of the locations that Mrs. Stewart, Miss Sutton, Miss Scott and them were talking about, Dubuque can have their own piece in this thing. It doesn't matter what we're doing in Waterloo or Clinton, Iowa, places like that. We're specifically right now focused and concentrating on the city of Dubuque. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what you're looking at, or what we're trying to do is, to me, when you look at the history of the state of Iowa, a lot of times, if you're visiting the state and you're African American, we were like, okay, what is the best piece and what destination makes sense when it comes to promoting Black Iowa? So to me, it was the Mississippi River. And specifically, why we picked the Mississippi River is because the Mississippi River in the state of Iowa was the first free state west of the Mississippi River. So our state was the first free state west of the Mississippi River, all based on the issue of slavery. Second, when you look at the history of Iowa, Iowa went from the Mississippi River historically probably to Iowa City, right? 50 miles. Iowa didn't go from Dubuque all the way to Council Bluffs. It went from Dubuque, maybe Des Moines, maybe Iowa City. So no matter if you was an Irish settler, if you was a German settler, if you was wherever you came from, that Mississippi River was very valuable to the history of the state of Iowa. The other part of it is if you look at the history of the Mississippi River and the river towns, that's where you're going to get the real, true history of the state of Iowa, the river towns. Not Waterloo, not the city of Des Moines, not Mason City. The river towns give you that true history. What we basically did was, if you see where it says Mississippi River Trail, the MRT, so the bike route and the bike route concept, we were like, okay, if you're a biker, if you're a person that ride bicycles, are there any Black experiences on a bike trail? Nobody didn't have the answer. So guess what? I went and found out. And the answer is absolutely. So no matter if we ride a bicycle on the Mississippi River Trail, there's going to be some type of Black history or some type of Black story along the trail. If you look at the Great River Road, which also covers the Mississippi River, there's going to be places you can stop. There's going to be African American small businesses on that same Great River Road. There's going to be African American nonprofit organizations along the Great River Road. There's going to be African American destinations, in some cases parks, outdoor recreation sites on the Great River Road. And then the bigger one is, if you want to drive it, you have Interstate 80, you have 380, you have 20. So the whole thing is, if you really want the Black experience in the state of Iowa and you really want to be connected, it takes the city of Dubuque to develop its resources, its African American resources, to get to that level. And right now, like I said, once we get out of this church and walk outside, there's nothing there. So right now, we're just in Fantasy Island right now. Okay, next slide, please. So I think I just talked about that too. The Great River Road, Mississippi River Trail. Okay, so the Great River Road and Mississippi River Trail are used interchangeably along the Mississippi River in Iowa. From Dubuque to Keokuk, many will use the Great River Road. From Dubuque to Keokuk, many will use the Mississippi River Trail. From Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota, many people will use both the Great River Road and Mississippi River Trail. I live in Bloomington, Minnesota right now, and the city of St. Paul is getting it in. They got a $150 million development as we speak right now. In 2025, they're taking the Mississippi River and taking it to a level you can't even think of. And the whole thing about it is they see the power of the Mississippi River. So when it comes to tourism, they're banking that people from all over the world is going to spend big money to get the experience of the Mississippi River. The National Park Service is their partner. So when it comes to St. Paul, the city of St. Paul, they partnered with the National Park Service. They partnered with all these great people to do what? The Iowa byways. I was in a meeting where they had like billions of dollars. They didn't have like a couple 100,000. They had billions and trillions of dollars to develop our byways. And they said, Charles, why don't you sit in on the meeting? And we want to hear what you think. All because I see a connection. All because when it comes to the state of Iowa, our state isn't really a part of that action. So if you look at the National Park Service, we really don't have national parks in Iowa, right? I think we have the Herbert Hoover location. And I want to say maybe one other national park in our state. And so if the federal government has all this funding, all this money, billions and trillions of dollars to parks and recreation to connect people, and our state is behind the 8 ball, what is that saying? So when it comes to cultural heritage tourism, how can we be part of the big picture, and when we walk out this building, we don't have nothing to showcase? We don't have nothing to show for it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this piece is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Iowa African American Heritage Trail partnered with the Mississippi River Trail, National Park Service, Midwest Region, and the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. What's so unique about the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, it was kind of weird. This guy named Mark Wyatt, he runs the Iowa Bicycle Coalition. They do the RAGBRAI stuff. And what they did was they asked me to participate in their bicycle summit. And I'm sitting here like, what the heck am I doing, on a bicycle summit, doing a presentation of the Iowa African American Heritage Trail? It was kind of weird at the time. But what came out of that is a lady by the name of Andrea Bolton, right? Andrea Bolton. She's with the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. And the crazy part was the Heritage Foundation, they do more stuff like in conservation, environment, outdoor recreation, parks and recreation, that type of stuff like that. And what they did was they had the very first ever African-American farm, and they protected it. It's a little bit different than preservation. Preservation, you're more, trying to preserve the building, that type of thing. Conservation means you're protecting it. Like, you cannot do nothing on it because it's protected. And what they did was protect the very first African-American farm, we think, in the history of the United States. So Buchanan County Conservation Board, the people of Buchanan County, their very first black settler that ever settled in their county they protected it. And they use conservation as the brand, not preservation, but conservation. And so when it comes to diversity and inclusion, let me see where I left off at. Having responsibility to uphold the values equality, diversity, justice, and inclusion. We serve as advocates for people of all backgrounds. Human rights and the rights of environment are intertwined, and we know together we can achieve our goals in a pro and healthy and community-serving project. The goal of this project is connect next to current bike riding enthusiasts to the Mississippi River and promote relevant Black history pertaining to the Mississippi River Trail. You guys are a part of that. The Mississippi River Trail exists in Dubuque, Iowa, right? I don't know, any of y'all ride bicycle? Bicycle riders? Okay, we need to talk. Because the people that ride bicycles, this is your piece right here, right? And the whole thing is that if we able to get people to get healthy and fit and learn African-American history and learn other history. It's not just African-American history. If you're from the state of Iowa, 90-something% of our state is Caucasian, right? So if you leave 90% of our state out of the conversation of where Black resources or Black destinations come in at, we can't even move the needle a little bit. But if 90% of our state, which is Caucasian, if they can see themselves in our conversation right now we can move the needle a little bit. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things with the Mississippi River Trail, we needed an example. So between the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, the Mississippi River Trail, and the National Park Service, I had to figure out a way to make sure, are they, when it comes to the Iowa African American Heritage Trail, are they all in? And if they're all in, what does it look like for them? And this is what it looks like for them. They got an organization called Major Taylor. It's probably the largest African American bicycle company or bicycle organization in the United States. But in the state of Iowa, in Des Moines, they got another Black organization called Black Girls Do Bikes. And so we partner with both of those organizations. So that way, when it comes to having a platform of Black professionals in the world of cycling and working with the NPS, the MRT, and the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, we can lean on those people and learn more about how bicycling can help us connect people to African American history and historic places. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm doing now, it's kind of weird how this thing is playing out, but this is an example of what we did in Davenport, Iowa. So in Davenport, Iowa, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in Davenport, what we basically did, if you've ever been to Davenport, they have this place called Lindsay Park. It's like a ritzy-pitsy, it's the village of East Davenport. It's kind of like a tourist destination. You got boats and yachts and all this kind of stuff over there. But we said, okay, if that's the destination, can we start our vision there? And that's what we did. So Lindsay Park is our very first point of interest. The last stop on this bike ride, and the bike ride is actually like somewhere between 15, 20-minute bike ride. The last stop is Nahant Marsh. And when it comes to Davenport, that location is their Illinois Central Railroad story. So just like Miss Sutton had her story, that's their story in Davenport. Next slide, please. Okay, so in Lindsay Park, what's unique is Lindsay Park is already on the National Registers of Historic Places, so we don't have to get a nomination. What we did was ask the city, can we get an amendment? So what amendment means, can we add that story to the nomination that's already been nominated? And they said absolutely. So now what you're looking at, Lindsay Park was a location that this group called the 60th U.S. Colored Infantry. That's the location where, when it came for Black people to sign a petition to be able to vote in the state of Iowa, they signed that petition, or they got the people to sign the petition at Lindsay Park. So prior to that, Black men that fought in the Civil War couldn't vote in the state of Iowa. And so we felt like that was a location and a destination where people can learn about that. But then also, I got here in 1862, Alexander Clark asked Iowa Governor Samuel Kirkwood for permission to recruit a company of black volunteers, but was told it was a white man's war. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1865 changed history. Clark recruited 1,153 blacks from the Iowa Volunteer of African American descent. Now, this is what people need to pay attention to. And a lot of people haven't talked about that. We might need Governor Kim Reynolds to jump in on this one right here. So Governor Kirkwood was the founder of the Republican Party in the state of Iowa. It was another guy by the name of, I can't think of his name off the top of it. So between Governor Kirkwood, his name is Edward Russell. Edward Russell was a citizen in the city of Davenport. Governor Kirkwood was the governor. Between Edward Russell and Governor Kirkwood is how we got the Republican Party founded in the state of Iowa. One of the problems that Governor Kirkwood and Russell and Clark was running into, you didn't have enough black men in Iowa at that time. Right? So what they end up having to do was recruit fugitive slaves to help Iowa meet their quota when it came to us being able to get federal funding from Lincoln for colored infantry. So can you imagine, it's 2022, and never in the history of our state, when it comes to America's only civil war, have we ever educated ourselves or others that we had fugitive slaves fight for our state in America's only civil war. It's amazing. It just blows my lid off every time I think about that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Alexander Clark is the same person when Mrs. Stewart was talking about, he was the same individual that daughter took their case to the Supreme Court justice, but Alexander Clark also was your Black Martin Luther King when it comes to the history of the state of Iowa. He would be on the same level as Martin Luther King. The other thing Clark was able to do, you guys have a little history about Prince Hall Masons, like so when it comes to the history of Masonry and Prince Hall Masons, he was the founder of Prince Hall Masons. He's the one who brought it to Iowa, brought it to Wisconsin, all those types of states. He was the man. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in the same area, the village of East Davenport, the oldest property in our state that's on record was owned by this lady named Rhodey Sims. And this black lady owned property in the 1840s. Not only did she own properties, all those little dots right around there, she owned all that land right there. And what's so crazy about Rhodey Sims, Hildreth, who gave her the house, and I'm trying to make sure I get it right. Okay, Rhodey Sims' daughter married this guy named John Ward. And what's so crazy about Rhodey Sims' story, her daughter's story, her daughter was the indentured servant or one of the cooks for Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? And her daughter married John Warwick, who was the indentured servant to Booth, whose son killed Abraham Lincoln. And they both living in the same house. And the house is the oldest property in the history of our state. And it's sitting here in the village of East Davenport. I'm sitting here like, wait a minute, man. I told the Davenport Preservation Commission, I said, shame on y'all, man. I told the Scott County Historical Society the same thing. I said, shame on y'all that the oldest property in the village, especially when it comes to black history, was owned by a black female in the 1840s. And when I went to the house, I just sat there and just like staring at it. But the crazy part is the other stories that go with it is even crazier. But because we had some people that were historians and some people that were archivists at that time felt like those stories didn't have a seat at the table. So now we're just talking about those stories in 2022 when we should have been talking about this stuff since 1840, right? Okay, next slide, please. So a buddy of mine, Steve Aarons, he runs a river development thing in Davenport. Me and him go back to like the farmers market and stuff like that, but he's a big dog now there. So I told Steve, look, Minor Woodman, at that time, Minor Woodman was the #1 minor league baseball stadium in the United States. So it was getting a lot of publicity at that time. And I told Steve, I said, look, man, how do y'all leave Negro League baseball out? I said, because it originally was called John O'Donnell Stadium. And so when it was John O'Donnell Stadium, they cannot sell the baseball stadium out unless Negro League baseball players came to play. So in the 30s, when they first opened the stadium up, we got more white people here than they had in their stadium. But when they end up having Negro League baseball, that stadium sold out. And so for them to create revenue, they made sure that they brought in Negro League All-Stars to play baseball at that stadium specifically for revenue purposes, because opening it up, they weren't getting any revenue. Okay, next slide, please. Where we at? Okay, so I talked to the city Parks and Recreation, and I was like, look, man, you guys got a brand new Veterans Memorial Park. Y'all pumping all this crazy money into the park. Is there any way we could take some black veterans, the history of black veterans, doesn't matter for Civil War, Vietnam, whatever, Buffalo Soldiers, whatever they want, can we make sure we at least add a piece of their story in there? And they said yes. So we made sure that if they did that we'll add them to the bike ride. Okay, next. Credit Island. This is crazy right here. This part woke me up. So on the same bike ride, they got this location called Credit Island. And what's unique about Credit Island, it goes back to the War of 1812. So, and you guys are them deep-rooted, history buffs. The War of 1812 was kind of unique because now you're talking about other black men from other countries. So you had a black colored infantry from Canada during the War of 1812, and they were fighting the United States on behalf of the British, specifically so the black Canadians wouldn't be part of slavery. So you're talking about in 1812, you had free black men in Canada that was fighting the United States specifically so they wouldn't have to deal with slavery like they were dealing with in the United States. I said, that's some amazing stuff right there. And so it doesn't matter if we talk about local, regional, or global history. Black history is tagged in every way, shape, or form. And to have black Canadians fight for their freedom against the United States that allowed slavery in the United States, I thought that was an amazing story. And that's me just over there chilling on the rock. I was like, man, let me take a picture of myself relaxing by the rock over here. Okay, next slide, please. Going back to what she was saying, when it comes to what people got to pay attention to, I think the most important piece is the Illinois Central Railroad historically was called the Freedom Train, right? So if you was a black person in the South, you only had two options: sharecrop or get on the Freedom Train. If you are a historian and you research the history of the Great Migration story was the Illinois Central Railroad story. That's the only way you was leaving the South to get to the North. I think the sad part is when it came to like Nahant Marsh. Nahant Marsh, if you go to Davenport, now it's more like an environmental site where they do like a lot of gun shooting. They had like a lot of lead and stuff like that. So it's more like an environmental site. If you look at the black history of Nahant Marsh, it was a 20th century industrial Negro railroad community. Just like in Dubuque, you have a 20th century industrial Negro railroad community. Just like in Waterloo, Iowa, 20th century industrial Negro railroad communities. Pretty much every black community in its early history in our state started with the railroad. Why? Because the railroad is the ones that built the community. Somewhere in history, Dubuque County had to pay the railroad to even come to Dubuque. If Dubuque County and if you citizens didn't have no money to pay these people, you didn't have no railroad. And so the whole thing is when you get the railroad here, now we need workers. Now we need labor workers. We need a force. So now the labor workers get here. The only place that they can stay in is either boxcars or an old shack or whatever the railroad company allowed them to have, that's what you had to survive off. And it wasn't just black people. You had Irish immigrants, you had German immigrants, you had all kind of European immigrants that was affected by the railroad. People gotta understand a lot of housing discrimination. So if you talk about housing discrimination, restrictive covenants, all that stuff like that, that was masterminded by the railroad. And then the local government picked up off of that and practiced restrictive covenants and housing restrictions and things of that nature. But the birth of it started with the railroad. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, that's it. So when it comes to my company, Pearson Consulting, and when it comes to Preserve Black America is basically making sure that when it comes to destinations and places you can visit, we're preserving it and we're connecting people with that. When it comes to my company, if you need help developing your African American history, historical resources, if you need help documenting it, if you need help with a plan, if you need help thinking of if your property needs, and I tell this to white and black people, just because this black person lived in the house and a white person owns it, doesn't mean that property owner doesn't still qualify for the assistance. The thing is we're telling the story of that property, and there's a lot of federal funding. There's a grant right now. If you're from here, you can write it down. It's called the United States African American Civil Rights Grant, right? If you're a property owner, if you're an individual property owner, and your individual property is significant to African American history, there's federal funding out there for you to restore it, rebuild it, revitalize it. But the catch-22 is you're telling your African American piece. It doesn't matter what color you are. As long as you qualify, I would suggest that you guys start applying for those fundings. Okay, that's my spiel. I know it's getting late. Any questions that anybody have for me? No questions? Okay. Okay.
Could you just say that grant again, the name of it?
Yes, it's called the United States. It's called the 20th Century African American Civil Rights Grant. And yeah, excellent. And yeah, I'm gonna start pointing at people. Ask me a question. Yeah, sure. How about yourself? You don't have a question? Okay, young lady right here. She doesn't have a question. I'm gonna flip over anybody. How about my friend over here? No questions? No questions. Okay. I want my man right there.
What can we do as Dubuquers to help continue the work that's going on with like the Black Heritage Trail? And I hope I'm using the correct term. Like, what can we do? Do we talk with our city councilors? What can we do to keep saying we want this? We want to celebrate and learn more, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that's our history. That's Absolutely. Our history.
I think the first step is, to me, does the black community have a plan, right? Since it's the black community's history, does the black community have a plan that goes with the city's comprehensive plan? So if the city has a comprehensive plan, does the black community have a plan that coexists with that plan? Because to me, if you haven't sat down, if the local government hasn't sat down with specific black professionals to write a plan to coexist with their plan, then you're not taking those steps, right? So you have to have a plan for that. Second, I think when it comes to what we're doing, if you guys see that your piece, so let's say, for example, we went to the Diocese of Dubuque yesterday. They only had one piece that they can contribute at the diocese, but that works. You know, that's one piece that we didn't have. When it came to Loris College, my man here, when we was at Loris has a nice piece. Loris has a nice piece that they can contribute. When it comes to the city of Dubuque, what y'all got to pay attention to is the city is doing a Black Heritage Survey, right? I'm the consultant, one of the consultants for the survey. And I'm sitting here telling you, this survey is powerful. It's way more powerful than what people are thinking. If you're not engaged in what the city's doing, you're not going to understand the level of where this thing is going. So when it comes to this survey, this is your next step to changing the black economy. If you guys want to see your black economy kind of change and do something different, the survey that Chris and them are doing with the city of Dubuque is the driver of that. But if you guys in the audience don't understand how the survey works and what it's all about, that's where we're going to lose. So if all my black friends in here right now, if y'all don't understand the survey, y'all can't take no next steps because you don't understand the survey. This city's preservation commission, they have a historical preservation commission in the city of Dubuque. They've never had black people sit on the commission, right? So if y'all don't have black professionals sitting on that commission, it's impossible for y'all to take the next step. And then once you guys figure that piece out and you understand what it looks like, now when we sit down with everybody else that understands how the certified local government works, that understand the value of the commission, now we all can take the next steps. But we as a black community, if we're not at certain tables, in this case, if we're not part of the Preservation Commission, this city's black history is going to go extinct like the dinosaurs. Like everybody said, you only have maybe 3 or 4 historical black families left, and they're going to go extinct. Okay, I'm going to end it, but I want to thank a couple people. I'm trying to think what I do with my list. I'm going to try to remember everybody off the top of my head. Okay, so I want to thank Molly from the chamber. I want to thank my man Dale. He's going to be working on a documentary. So some of the stuff we're doing right now is a documentary. So we're being video recorded. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so Dale Campbell up there, he's going to be one of your go-to people here in the future. This right here is like the first steps of a documentary of the Black History Dubuque. Molly from the chamber, she invested in this program. Oh, that's Molly right here. Hi, Molly. Hi. Okay. I want to thank Mrs. Stewart. She's a huge advocate for moving black history forward. And she's also was able to give us this church. I'd like to thank you and the church for giving us a platform to have this Juneteenth event. Franny's Barbecue. The crazy part, I was looking forward to eating a piece of barbecue and still ain't ate none of Franny's Barbecue, but we want to thank Franny for the free lunch we had. The Dubuque NAACP, I want to thank the Dubuque NAACP for allowing me to be part of their meeting, but also meet my man back here, Mr. Anderson, and some of the other members of the Dubuque NAACP. And then I want to thank Kyle Rains. Is Kyle still here? Kyle Rains and his father, they are with New Life Baptist Church. Huge supporter of what we're doing. And once again, Dale Campbell is with Positive Productions Plus. So when we get this thing documented, it's all Dubuque driven. If any of you Dubuqueans want to be part of what we're doing, I got a sheet at the table with all my information. It also has the other people from Dubuque's information on there. Okay.
Before we go, I just want to give a thank you to all of the St. Lucers who helped today. So we have Sue Haddle in the back, Terry Stewart, Claudette Bees was floating around. She was formerly of the Baptist Church. She's now came over to help host today. We have Vicki Tilson and Mark Tilson who helped run the tech for today and also helped with recording it, so we might get it posted later. And then we also had Marilyn helping downstairs with the food too. So thank you to all of the volunteers who helped with everything helping at the church today. If I missed anyone, thank you again. And then also Anthony Allen, who's the president of the NAACP in the back.
Okay, thank you guys, and y'all have a great Juneteenth weekend. Thank you so much.